Lecture 5. Lincoln Returns to Politics.
Welcome back. In our last lecture, we talked about Lincoln's opposition to the Mexican War during his single term in Congress, and then the eulogy that he delivered upon the death of Henry Clay. Each of these represents a natural segue to where we go next, because although Lincoln retired from Congress after that one term, the fruits of the Mexican War would create the conditions that reignited the slavery controversy and brought him back into politics. And just as he tried to find a middle way between supporting abolition and supporting slavery, that would be his continuing quest when he returned to the public forum. Lincoln began speaking again in 1854. But before we pick up his oratorical career, we probably need to spend some time refreshing our memory about the events that brought him back into politics. They're somewhat difficult and complicated, and I suspect it may have been some years since many of us first encountered them. And so in this lecture, what I would like to do is to review the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the conflicts that they would produce. I want to begin with the Missouri Compromise, actually. It was passed in 1820 at the time that Missouri became a state. And the important part of it for our purposes was that it provided that while Missouri came into the Union as a slave state, in all of the rest of the territory that we obtained from the Louisiana Purchase, north of latitude 3630, slavery would be prohibited. Now, 3630 was the southern border of Missouri. So all the rest of the area north of there that we obtained from the Louisiana Purchase would be closed to slavery. South of 3630, slavery was free to go or not, as circumstances would dictate. We need to know for our purposes that at the time the Missouri Compromise was passed, the North was not particularly happy with it. Many Northerners believed that it was much more likely that in the future the country would expand southward rather than northward, and hence that more area would be open to slavery. They accepted the Missouri Compromise in part because it also provided that while Missouri came in as a slave state, Maine would come in as a free state to keep the number of free and slave states equal. But over time, this 3630 line, which Northerners originally had accepted as an expedient, came to be called by them a sacred principle. And so we'll see in the mid-1850s, when the proposal is made to change the Missouri Compromise, there will be a good deal of an uproar. Now, the idea for the proposed change in the Missouri Compromise came from another compromise, the Compromise of 1850, which dealt with the question of how to govern the area that the United States acquired as a result of the Mexican War, which included the present-day states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah. A congressman named David Wilmot from Pennsylvania had introduced a measure providing that in all of that area, slavery would be prohibited. The House routinely passed the Wilmot Proviso. The Senate just as routinely defeated it. And in the stalemate that resulted, no government was provided for this vast area of land. What forced the issue, of course, was the discovery of gold in California, which increased the population in California so much and so quickly that California was ready to come into the Union as a state, bypassing territorial status altogether. So the question became urgent, how to deal with these new territories. And the result was the Compromise of 1850, championed by Henry Clay, his last major act of statesmanship before his death. It was a complicated compromise. It had many parts. One of them was that California would come into the Union as a free state. Another was that there would be a stricter fugitive slave law requiring the assistance of people in returning fugitives to those who claimed to be their owners. Another part was the adjustment of the boundaries of the state of Texas to their present size from the gargantuan area that had been claimed by the Republic of Texas, which of course limited the area where slavery existed since Texas came in as a slave state, but in return the United States assumed the debts of the Republic of Texas. Another part was the abolition of the slave trade, not slavery itself, but the buying and selling of slaves in the District of Columbia. But the part of the compromise that's most important to us is the part that provided that in the rest of the area acquired from Mexico, all except for California, the status of slavery would not be determined in advance, but it would be determined by the people who actually went there to live. This was the principle called popular sovereignty, which the Democrats had made part of their platform in 1848. So the area that today represents Arizona and New Mexico, and the area that today represents Nevada and Utah, was potentially open to slavery if the settlers who went there found it hospitable. This was called popular sovereignty, and it was part of the Compromise of 1850. Now, once that compromise with all of its parts was passed, it seemed to everyone, or just about everyone, north and south, that this was the final settlement of the slavery question, because now there was no piece of land under the control of the United States for which the status of slavery was unknown. In the unorganized part of the Louisiana Purchase area, north of 3630 it was prohibited, south of 3630 it was permitted. In the area gained from the Mexican War, it was open based on the principle of popular sovereignty. And so congressional resolutions proclaimed this the final settlement of all the vexing questions. Both political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, in their 1852 platforms, likewise pronounced it the final settlement of the slavery question. We know otherwise, of course. We know that while on the surface this settled the question, there were a number of difficult issues that were still seething just below the surface. The Compromise of 1850 had been passed under Southern threats to secede from the Union if slavery were not to be permitted to go into the new territories. In other words, if the Wilmot Proviso had passed. And while the Compromise of 1850 put an end to that talk, there were still latent secessionist movements in some parts of the South, and they were taken seriously. Meanwhile, in the North, the stricter fugitive slave law was hardly popular, and it indeed inspired resistance and arguments that northern states could pass laws that would protect fugitive slaves, notwithstanding the federal fugitive slave law. Abolitionists, who had been driven out of the public forum in the spirit of compromise, came back and began to speak again. The novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, exposed for many of its readers the harsh realities, the stark realities of conditions under slavery. It dramatized the plight of the slave. And renewed efforts were made to try to add new territory to the South, particularly to annex Cuba. Every one of these efforts failed. And in the failure of these efforts, we began to see the limits of manifest destiny, and hence the unlikelihood that new areas south of 3630 would be open to slavery. But of course, all these problems could be seen clearer with 20/20 hindsight than they could at the time that the Compromise of 1850 was passed and everybody proclaimed it to be final. But there was no mistaking what would ignite the controversy once again. In the first few days of the year 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas, who chaired the Senate Committee on Territories, introduced a bill to organize a territorial government in the upper part of the Louisiana Purchase. This, remember, was the area from which slavery was prohibited, but it had so far been completely unorganized. It was almost depopulated. In fact, the maps at the time often referred to this as the Great American Desert. It was all referred to as Nebraska. And it's important to realize that when I talk about Nebraska, I mean the area that represents the present-day states of Kansas, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. Douglas proposed to organize a territorial government for all of this area. There's lots of speculation about what his motives in doing that might be. Certainly one of the most plausible motives is that Douglas was trying to get Congress to approve a transcontinental railroad that would link California with the rest of the country. And a transcontinental railroad was such an expensive capital project, it was the 1850s equivalent of the space program, that there was only one that was going to be built, and the question was, where would it go? There would be immense economic benefits to whatever part of the country was at the eastern end of the railroad, and Douglas, like a good senator representing his constituents, wanted to start at Chicago and go west from Chicago. But the fact that there was no government for all of this vast territory was a considerable deterrent to that route, if for no other reason because there would be no protection of the land claims made by the railroad companies. There are other theories that have been advanced as well, but that strikes me as the most plausible. Now, when Douglas introduced his plan, the question was whether he could get enough support for it. And it became clear that a number of influential Southern senators, who after all had their own idea about where the railroad should go, namely from New Orleans and across Texas, a number of Southern senators made it clear to Douglas that the price of their support for his territorial organization proposal would be the repeal of the Missouri Compromise restriction that prohibited slavery. In other words, they would vote to organize a territorial government in Nebraska if Douglas would agree that that territory would at least be potentially open to slavery. Douglas was, if anything, a politician of the opportunistic kind. He saw a chance here to make a deal, and he agreed to it. Originally, he tried to do it on the sly. He wrote the bill in such a way that it did not explicitly repeal the Missouri restriction. That wasn't enough for the Southerners. They demanded an outright statement of repeal, and so Douglas submitted a new version of the bill containing such a statement, claiming, by the way, that he had intended it all along and that it was left out of his earlier bill through clerical error. Now, was Douglas doing anything significant in repealing the Missouri Compromise restriction? He said no. Why not? Because, he said, the Missouri Compromise has already been superseded by the Compromise of 1850. And here's where the popular sovereignty provision comes in. He said in 1850, we accepted the principle that slavery in the new territory should be determined by popular sovereignty. And that takes precedence over the Missouri Compromise. Now, by the way, Douglas's opponents would have great fun with this argument. It had a couple of obvious problems. For one, you could search the record of the debates over the 1850 Compromise, and you would find nobody, including Douglas himself, nobody claiming that the Compromise of 1850 superseded the Missouri Compromise. They applied to entirely different areas of land. The Missouri Compromise applied to the area we got from the Louisiana Purchase. The Compromise of 1850 to the area that we got from the Mexican War. One had nothing to do with the other. In fact, the year before, in 1853, Douglas was defending the Missouri Compromise and proposing that the 3630 line be extended all the way to the Pacific. So when Douglas now said the Compromise of 1850 supersedes the Missouri Compromise, he was flying in the face of the historical record. But he nonetheless maintained that popular sovereignty was a principle that had replaced the principle of drawing a line. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was controversial. Again, Douglas didn't think it would be. He believed that as a practical matter, there was no way that slavery would spread into this upper part of the Louisiana Purchase. The climate, he thought, would not be hospitable for it. But of course, he couldn't say that publicly, because if he said it publicly, then popular sovereignty would be exposed as a sham, offering nothing to these Southerners in return for their votes to organize the territory. But Douglas thought this was no big deal, that this was just a way to smooth things over and get political advantage. Boy, was he mistaken. No sooner did he introduce the Kansas-Nebraska Act than the controversy over slavery erupted all over again. He was severely taken to task by some of the northern senators who published a manifesto denouncing him and denouncing this act. The Missouri Compromise, which the North, remember, originally had not been all that crazy about, now was talked about as a sacred pledge, a sacred compact, which Douglas was somehow transgressing and violating. Southerners, on the other hand, had not lobbied for its repeal. But now that their section was being insulted by these northern attacks, insisted upon repeal of the Missouri Compromise and the possible spread of slavery as a litmus test for their support for measures adopted by the North. Well, Congress debated the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it eventually passed. It passed almost on a party line vote, and it was signed into law by President Franklin Pierce. This act is what would bring Lincoln back into politics, as he would begin in 1854 to campaign for Whig candidates who were opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and pledged to its repeal. When we get to our next lecture, we'll look in detail at how Lincoln developed his position in 1854. But I want, before we do that, to follow what happened after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. One of the things that it did was to divide this territory into two. One part, the southern part, to be called Kansas, the northern part to be called Nebraska. There's a good deal of speculation as to why that was done. One of the theories was that it gave two possibilities for a northern railroad route. One, the one that Douglas favored, going from Chicago, and another favored by Senator Thomas Hart Benton, going from St. Louis. Whatever the motivation, it became clear that if slavery had a chance to go anywhere in this area, it would be in Kansas. Kansas, after all, was directly west of Missouri, a slave state, and the greatest concentration of slaves in Missouri was in the western part of the state, just across the border. So where there was a possibility for slavery to spread was Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was silent on one very important question. It held, consistent with popular sovereignty, that the decisions about slavery in the territory would be made by the people who went there to live, but it didn't say when. It didn't say whether it would be made right when the territory first became organized, or when the population had reached some critical level, or when Kansas came into the Union as a state. And this very ambiguity led to a mad rush to settle Kansas in order to have the advantage when the question of slavery was decided. A group of anti-slavery organizations in New England formed societies called the New England Emigrant Aid Societies, the purpose of which was to provide money to anti-slavery men who were willing to go from New England out to Kansas. There weren't too many of them, as you might imagine. But the publicity over the New England anti-slavery societies ignited concern among slaveholders in Missouri, who quickly rushed across the border and began to settle eastern Kansas. And while they were in the majority, as they were at first, because they could get to Kansas easiest, they tried to assure that Kansas would decide for slavery. They tried to assure it by fair means and foul. For example, the early Kansas territorial legislature passed laws making it a crime even to advocate an anti-slavery position. This was among the most repressive of laws dealing with slavery that had been passed anywhere. The territorial legislature gerrymandered the voting districts so that the slaveholders from Missouri, many of whom had come over, staked a claim to land, and then gone back to Missouri, would have a disproportionate influence in any election that took place. They very quickly organized a convention to draft a constitution to bring Kansas into the Union as a slave state. This convention met in the town of Lecompton. While it was meeting, the balance between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in Kansas began to shift, because Kansas became a symbol for the whole country of the contest between freedom and slavery. And so an increasing number of free state supporters from Illinois and Iowa began to move into Kansas, and at some point, probably around 1856 or 57, they most likely outnumbered the supporters of slavery in Kansas. But while this was happening, the Lecompton Convention was meeting, and it drafted a constitution according to which Kansas would come into the Union as a slave state. There was a problem, however, with this constitution, and that was that the President of the United States, who by this time was James Buchanan, had publicly committed himself that popular sovereignty meant that the people of Kansas would have a chance to vote on slavery, so that it would be decided according to the wishes of the settlers who went there to live. And so there were two different theories at work. The Lecompton Convention was perfectly legal. It was a representative body representing the settlers who were there at the time the convention was called. But if one did a survey of the people in Kansas at the time the convention reported out its document, the majority would have been anti-slavery. Which really represented popular sovereignty? The representativeness of the convention or the vote that Buchanan had promised? Well, the delegates at Lecompton took no chances. They said, you know what? All the controversy about this document has to do with the slavery clause. And so let's have an election focusing on that clause. Let's decide on the Constitution with slavery or the Constitution without slavery. But here's the rub. The Constitution without slavery meant that no new slaves could be brought into Kansas. But the slaves that were already there and their descendants would remain slaves under the Constitution, quote, without slavery. On the other hand, the Constitution with slavery meant additional slaves could be brought into Kansas. The men of the Lecompton Convention were not stupid. They figured that this way they would guarantee their advantage whichever way the referendum went. The Free State supporters were not stupid either. They said, come on, there's no way that we can vote against slavery in this referendum. And so what did they do? They boycotted the referendum. The result was the Lecompton Constitution overwhelmingly was approved with slavery. And so it went to the U.S. Congress that was asked to admit Kansas as a slave state. President Buchanan supported this. He supported it because the Lecompton Convention was legal. It was a representative body. It had acted its will. There had been a referendum. And most important, if Kansas came in, there would be 2 more Democratic senators and would help Buchanan out in terms of party support. And besides all that, it would get the question of slavery in Kansas off the agenda. Stephen Douglas broke with Buchanan on this issue. Douglas said, the Lecompton Constitution is a mockery of popular sovereignty. It clearly does not represent the wishes of the people of Kansas, and so I oppose it. I oppose it not because it supports slavery. Indeed, he would say in a famous line, I don't care whether slavery is voted up or voted down. A line that Lincoln would take out of context over and over again. That wasn't why he opposed Lecompton. He opposed it because it wasn't genuine popular sovereignty. And so Douglas found himself at odds with the administration of his own party. And by the same token, he found himself temporarily at least on the same side as the people who for many years had been his political opponents. And indeed, some of them thought that Douglas would be the most attractive candidate that they now could support. And as we will see, that would pose a significant political threat to Lincoln. Now, these events that I have just described, the controversy over the settlement of Kansas and over the Lecompton Constitution, took place in 1855, 1856, and 1857. During that time, the whole issue of slavery in the territories was smoldering. The events in Kansas became symbolic of the larger question. And during this period of time, Lincoln was speaking out more and writing more and beginning to evolve his views on the slavery question. Now, as we saw when we discussed his eulogy for Henry Clay, Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He supported the right of the southern states to maintain slavery because he believed it was enshrined in the Constitution. He supported the fugitive slave law because he believed it was a constitutional guarantee. And yet, like his patron saint Henry Clay, he opposed slavery itself. So what Lincoln will have to do during these years from 1854 to 1857 is he will need to try to figure out some kind of middle ground between supporting slavery and supporting abolition. In the very first lecture, I said that rhetoric deals with constraints, and these would be powerful constraints imposed on Lincoln. He had to somehow navigate his way between these positions, both of which he would oppose. In the course of doing that, Lincoln would work out a theory of American history, a theory of the Constitution, a theory of the nature of slavery that would carry him not only during these critical years of the mid-50s, but during the crucial contest with Douglas for the Senate, during the presidential election, and indeed into the office of the presidency of the United States. So let's try to draw together what these key events are that would bring Lincoln back into politics. The Missouri Compromise had closed the upper part of the Louisiana Purchase to slavery. The Compromise of 1850 had opened Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah to the possibility of slavery if people who went there decided on it. Douglas, introducing the Kansas-Nebraska Act, repealed the Missouri Compromise, claiming that the Compromise of 1850 had superseded it. This spurred great controversy, a mad rush to settle Kansas, taking advantage of the situation by the earliest settlers there and the controversy over the Lecompton Constitution. In our next lecture, we'll explore how Lincoln would deal with this situation, beginning with a speech that he delivered in 1854 in Peoria.